So thank you all for joining this webinar about the implementation of Canada's FSC Control Wood National Risk Assessment that was recently published by FSC International and FSC Canada earlier in June of this year. So I will just quickly present myself and talk about what we're doing today, and then open it to Chiara to do the same. So again, I'm Etienne Belanger. I'm Director of Forestry with the Forest Product Association of Canada. I was also on the working group as a representative for the Economic Chamber on the National Risk Assessment Working Group for Canada for the last 2 years. It's been a long process that originates back to 2012, but the bulk of the work has been done in more recent year after 2015. So happy to speak and give context about how we arrived at this final risk assessment and through the different iterations on draft and through the consultation that we went through. So there was 2 of them. However, just an upfront note to the fact that we don't represent FSC itself, so either FSC Canada or FSC International. If you have official question you would like to address to FSC regarding this national risk assessment, we recommend that you contact Vivian Peachy. That is, her contacts are identified in the national risk assessment. What we're going to provide here are some context and ideas and our understanding of where the risk assessment is at, and Chiara is also going to provide more on the side of how to implement, how this gets audited, and what are the next steps. So maybe Chiara now.
Sure, thanks very much, Etienne. Hello everybody, and thanks for joining us today. So my name is Chiara McCarthy, and I'm the FSC Controlled Wood Program Lead at SCS Global Services. So I work as a technical specialist and also an auditor. And at SCS, we have been involved with a number of new national risk assessments and centralized national risk assessments that have been released for various different countries around the world, and have been involved with auditing organizations that have, are making the transition or have made the transition to using the relevant FSC risk assessments. So today, as part of this webinar, I will be talking at the latter part of this, and we'll be talking about some of the logistics in terms of audits, to understanding the timelines and considerations for existing certificate holders or organizations that are hoping to source from Canada, so new certificate holders. I'll talk a little bit about some of the terminology within the National Risk Assessment and tie that back into the standard and where some of that is coming from. And also in terms of the control measures, I'll talk about some thoughts on providing conformance to your auditor and some of the questions to really think about as everybody goes down this path of aligning with the National Risk Assessment by the 26th of December for Canada, and then going through your audit process. Okay, so that's what I'll be talking about later on in the webinar, but for now we have a couple of things that we want to point out to you all. So you all should see your dashboard when you logged in, either through your computer or smartphone. We will have a questions and answer session at the end because we have a lot of material to cover. Maybe some of the questions will be covered during the presentation. If it's not, we have a questions tab on your dashboard. So you can see there's a chat box at the very bottom, and above that there's a questions tab. So you have a couple of options there where you can type your questions in there directly. You can perhaps add them into the chat box, or if you wish to verbalize or be unmuted and ask your question that way. Please do just say that you have a question in the chat box, and we'll come and find you in the attendee list, unmute you so you can actually be part of the discussion if that's what you want to do. So you have two options: type your question or chat, talk about your question. So that's it for me for right now. Etienne, I'm going to hand back over to you to get cracking on the actual presentation part. So, and just before we do that, another colleague of mine, Nikki Helms, is on the line here as well, and she will be answering any logistical questions as we go along. If you put those in the chat box, you're not sure what to do, she'll be able to answer those questions for you. Okay. All right, Etienne, thank you.
Thank you. Just two other quick notes before we start. So this webinar is being recorded at the moment and going to be made available to all registered users afterward. So we're going to take some time to work on the Q&A document following the questions at the end, but that's going to be shared with all of you afterward. So with that, I'll start if it wants. Okay, so the National Risk Assessment for Canada officially started to be valid as of June 26th. There was a scenario where we might have needed other types of risk assessment if this was not finalized by the end of June, but it was. So let's focus just on this tool that becomes the only risk assessment going forward for Control Wood for Canada. Replacing all company risk assessment, as I'm sure you're very familiar with. It's going to remain valid for 5 years, at the longest. It can be revised before. There can be small addition or a complete review, depending if FSC decides to take on the exercise earlier, but it can be valid up to 5 years. Otherwise, in terms of the full context of the years of preparation and the different steps in how this assessment came together, for sake of time and focus, we're not covering these details in full in this presentation. You're welcome to look at the introduction in the National Risk Assessment, notably on page 6 and 7, that will give you the larger background. For today, we're going to speak more to how it came to be in terms of methodology and information that were used, and what's the outcome. So what are the risks that are determined, and there is, and what are the associated control measures that will be required to be implemented to allow for control wood to be sourced. So in the developing of the National Risk Assessment, there's a specific procedure under FSC that was used and has to be used to develop these documents. It's a different procedure, although very related, but different from the one that was out there for developing company risk assessment. And so basically, it goes through these 5 steps identified here by the section titles in the procedure. But it starts with finding the scope at which the risk has to be determined, which in many cases here is going to be the whole country. And then the gathering of information, which, and we'll speak later to limitation, but was a challenge in trying to get some homogeneous risk designation, as not all information was national in scope, and many provincial information wasn't always as easy to use to make the assessment consistent across the country, which was an effort made by the working group. So based on the information, then you work to step 3 and try to determine at what scale you're able to determine homogeneous risk, trying to go as precise and localized as needed to come up with appropriate designations. Then you make such a designation based both on judgment, but also on the guidance provided in the procedure, as well as some very specific thresholds that determine if you can meet or not a low risk designation based on specific thresholds for each different subject. So we're going to mention some of that as we revise these risk determination today. And finally, in the event where you do specify a risk, then you need to determine control measures that will mitigate that risk, that are related to how you came to the conclusion that there is a risk, then your control measure needs to be coherent with that, with wider risk and whether or not your control measure is going to achieve what it needs to consider the risk mitigated. Quickly, just wanted to mention, because this is a very new product and new reality for risk assessment, it was challenging to make this exercise at the national level, although that was clearly the task. So some challenge on data quality, but also availability. I mentioned quickly earlier the discrepancy between provincial information maybe versus national. So for us to access relevant, up-to-date, consistent, but also publicly available data for all regions of the country, also for the specific elements of the control wood, which is not always the same vernacular of what is used in publication or official documentation, was a challenge. So sometimes we had to use proxy information that was best aligned with the risk categories that FSC is working with. That was one challenge. Another one was about, so lots of challenge around determining risk for Indigenous rights, including the scale. So doing it at the national level was extremely challenging. We debated lots of ways and ideas around how to get down to the community level, but in the end, it was not quite feasible and aligned with our capacity and mandate. So we do recognize some of that incompatibility between the scale at which we had to assess the risk and how this could be assessed at a more applied scale at a community by community level. So there was some recommendation made about further steps in how to continue to advance that, notably associated with the draft 2, where the working group put a letter in about recommended next steps. So we'll see if that becomes the source of a revision or a partial revision of the national risk assessment in the years ahead, just to flag that. Also, difficult to work with the notion of low risk, no risk, and what is negligible risk. So there's a bit of subjectivity there, which made it challenging. So we tried to balance and make best effort to balance what we know of the Canadian context with keeping in light with a precautionary approach as required and recommended by the procedure we had to follow. And finally, very difficult, at least over time for the working group, it was a learning to try to get away from the forest management tenure-based mindset of what is forestry and how we can act and operate on forestry activities versus a supply chain tool, which really control wood is, and therefore how to create opportunities and control measures at different points in time and space of a supply chain, which led to a bit of a menu approach to control measure. And that's why for many risk determined, you'll see many, honestly, lots of control measures sometimes on a single subject, trying to recognize both that the people that want to be certified for control wood might be at very different places in the supply chain, far or close to the forest, far or close from decisions made on the ground, but also recognizing that even provincial or regional realities are quite different. So you have to recognize different tools to try to fit as much context as possible. So that's, in a nutshell, where we come from with the product as a working group. Now, getting into substance, so you probably know them, but the 5 control wood categories that are assessed in any risk assessment are these. So illegally harvested wood, 2, wood harvested in violation of traditional and human rights. 3, wood harvested in forests with high conservation values that are threatened. And 4, wood harvested in forests being converted to plantation or non-forest use. And 5, wood from forests where genetically modified trees are planted. So we did not find risk in all these categories, but under sub-elements of category 2, 3, and 4. So category 1 and 5 are low risk. We're not going to discuss them in details here. A very interesting documentation exercise and some good reading there that I encourage you to look at. But for what we're going to be focused on today, it's going to be these 5 subcategories or indicators of risk. So we did specified risk on 2.3 for the rights of Indigenous people, and that risk is designated for the entire country. Then we identifying risk for 3 different HCVs. So HCV1 about species diversity, HCV2 about landscape level ecosystem, and HCV4 about critical ecosystem services. All of these are not for the entire country, but for some specific areas. So on 1, it's for 25 specific ecoregions that are listed in the document, and we'll look at that later. For 2, it's a risk that's been specified for specific IFLs 1 by 1. So you have to look at the map and the list to know exactly where they are. And for 4, the risk designation was made at the provincial/territorial level. So it's Yukon and Northwest Territories that were deemed at risk. Finally, for category 4, for conversion, risk were determined by reporting zones, which are different from the ecoregions and different from the eco zones used in draft 2. So we'll speak to that in more detail later. Starting with category 2, and more specifically 2.3, so about Indigenous rights. Here, the scale of assessment, as mentioned earlier, and some methodological challenges was in the end decided to be done nationally as opposed to different or very locally. And the assessment was driven by a flow of questions from the most general about whether or not there's Indigenous people present in the area until if there is conflict, is the conflict resolution accepted or not by Indigenous people. So that flow comes from the procedure to develop national risk assessment. And in the assessment, you'll see that each is discussed and documented. I'll just quickly go through some of the observations made. So yes, obviously there are Indigenous people in Canada. That's very well known. Maybe less well known that we have not ratified ILO Convention 169. There is an engagement to implement United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. However, at this point, there is still no accountability mechanism associated with that. And the commitment towards UNDRIP is not has not been done also at the provincial level, which maintains some uncertainty, except for a couple of examples, notably BC recently. Then entering more harder to answer question, is there evidence of violations or infringements of Indigenous rights? So the position took there was a bit of starting from the high level, and since rights are not all settled, the position is that infringement of right occurs every day for a variety of reasons, including areas where treaties are not yet signed, land claim negotiations are still ongoing, and there's no requirement for free, prior, and informed consent at this point. So that national position was took. Which leads then to, okay, if there is infringement, is there formal/legal mechanism to mitigate these infringements? And there again, the conclusion was mitigated and had pros and cons. So although constitutionally protected, the legal tests remain difficult, remain expensive and exhaustive. So legal hurdles to proving Section 35 rights makes litigation complex, expensive, risky, and slow. So that's a comment on these existing mechanisms. Also interesting to note that many of the legal challenges that existed in the past about the duty to consult and accommodate Indigenous people came from the forest sector. And also at this point, there's no legal formal mechanism about the need to obtain free, prior, and informed consent. So that's about what's existing. Then the last couple of questions are, is there conflicts, and are they as a result of forest management activity? So on that front, it was identified that there are challenges, there are conflicts still in place, including the note that Indigenous people situation was one of the most pressing human rights issues facing Canada. There's no evidence that recent blockades stem from gross violation of rights as defined by FSC. Also, case of other vernaculars used in the procedure, like destruction of property, preventive military bodies, systemic acts of intimidations, were part of an unfortunate history, but there's no such case that took place recently. So no clear directly related to forest management activity. There's no clear conflicts that was pointed to in the assessment. But then at the last question about whether or not the process in place to deal with potential conflict are deemed fair and equitable, that was very hard to answer, and probably would have a mixed answer if we were to ask many communities. So taking all of these into account, the conclusion presented a mixed conclusion with elements that do support low risk and elements that support specified risk. So, for example, among the elements that were supportive of a low risk conclusion, that there was several examples where Indigenous rights were upheld by the courts, which does support a low risk based on threshold 18. There was also no recent case of conflicts of substantial magnitude in the forest sector, which supported a low risk by threshold 19. So that could have been the determination. However, based on other elements, so including that general broader idea that infringement of rights occur every day for a number of reasons, because rights are not yet all settled, and FPAC is not yet a requirement. So on that basis, there was strong opposition from key stakeholders, notably the Aboriginal Chamber itself, that has to support the conclusion of risk assessment as all chamber for a low risk designation around the country. So do I have a last one? Yeah. So in sum, what the decision was made to apply a precautionary approach and therefore designate a specified risk for all of Canada. And what was used was the establishment of a specific threshold, which the framework does allow. So threshold 27, that now say that data are not available or are insufficient to determine the extent to which violation of Indigenous rights as a result of forest management activities is occurring. And that's one common thing in all the different sections of the procedure. What the procedure for risk assessment asks is, when data is not available, you end up in a risk situation. So that's one way to identify risk. It was noted, and there's nuances made in control measure, I believe, that the organization best positioned to address these issues are the primary producer, meaning the entity that receives the material from the forest, so that the first manager or player. So we have a risk there for the whole country, which leads us to then work with control measure. I ask you to pay attention when we are in control measure to look at whether or not they are flagged as recommended or mandatory, which are two types of control measure. We'll discuss at the end the difference between both, but quickly and naturally, the mandatory ones, it's harder to move away from and use something else. It's possible. You can use something else in mandatory control measure, but the test is higher than for recommended control measure, which can be replaced by others a little more easily than mandatory ones. So in this case, we're talking about recommended control measures. You can come up with something more appropriate if needed in your supply area. So they are divided in two parts. So for 1 to 4, this is to be applied by organization directly. So the primary producers, basically, the ones that source directly from the forest. You can use one or more, so it's at least one control measure is to be used. So first, indigenous people do not oppose the forest management plan. So quite specific. There's also a definition for do not oppose, which is not carried here, but that's what it means when you see these little stars. Other option is to have an agreement that exists between these indigenous people and the manager that follows the principle of FPAC, not necessarily an FPAC agreement, but something along the line. Third option, which, if I remember right, is a control measure that you will find in all areas of risk determined for this national risk assessment because of the importance given to indigenous stewardship by FSC. So third option is an indigenous-led or co-developed land use plan is in place within the supply area. And finally, best efforts to engage with indigenous people to understand if their rights have been violated as a result of forest management activity is demonstrated. So that's your 4 options for primary producer. If you're not a primary producer, you can ensure that a dispute resolution process is established to address issues arising from violations of rights of indigenous people related specifically to forest management activity. And it is implemented if there's a dispute of substantial magnitude in the supply area, which dispute of substantial magnitude is also a concept defined by FSC in the risk assessment. So that's the full menu here to be applied throughout the country. If we now move to the next category, 3, about high conservation values, starting with the first, it's named species diversity. It includes concepts like concentration of biological diversity, endemic species, rare, threatened, or endangered species that are significant at global, regional, or national levels. So that was lots of work and time spent to try to see what data we can work with nationally. The working group has paid considerable attention to that specific subcategories. In the end, we landed on using 2 distinct approaches to assess risk for HCU1. So we looked at both concentration of species at risk critical habitat, including all forest-dwelling species specifically. And another approach was about species of special significance, where the focus was on woodland caribou. So starting with the first one, we compare a number of sources of information and found that what was the most coherent, consistent way to arrive to a conclusion that matched the different types of information we've been able to look at was to develop a species richness indicator and to use a ratio of more than 3. There was some subjectivity there, but also lots of work to compare with other potential sources of information. So there was a good coherence between sources at a ratio of 3, which gives us these 6 ecoregions as specified risk for all species at risk that are forest dwelling in these regions. So I don't copy and paste here the full list of all species per ecoregion, but the National Risk Assessment provides it. So each ecoregion does list the one species that this is about, and for which then control measure will need to be applied for each species. These ecoregions are primarily in areas where urbanization and human development is taking place the most, which makes sense. But the ratio approach was also trying to stay away from richness only, where by default the north would be excluded because less species are present because of its biology. So that's why it was not only either the south that was considered. The threshold that was met to determine that specified risk is that the HC1 is identified, its occurrence is likely in the area, and it's threatened by management activities, which was one of the tests for listing species. I've already mentioned the ecoregion. If we put them on a map, and that map's not part of the National Risk Assessment, but in the National Risk Assessment, there's a map and a link towards the ecoregion map. Here is just trying to highlight only the ecoregions where you see risk, so 2 on the West Coast and the remainder in Southern Ontario, Southern Quebec, and the East Coast. So you can look at that in more details later. That gives you a sense. I'll come back to control measure later because some of them work for both species at risk in general and woodland caribou more specifically, so we'll discuss them jointly. The second category of HC1 was species of special significance, and here the species that have arguably received more national attention, like none other than woodland caribou. So it was the focus of literature, focus of working group attention as well. So what we've tried to accomplish there was to develop a structured threat assessment to see, okay, how do we determine where and if woodland caribou is threatened by forest management activity. So we used a lot the federal assessment of protection of critical habitat, which was a coherent national-based source of assessment of threat. Then we look at whether or not there was protection from harvesting activities, and also if the habitat of certain herds were already fully addressed by a federally recognized action plan towards species recovery. These were the 3 main subjects covered. Again, in the end, the same threshold was deemed met, and it was deemed met for all ecoregions of the different woodland caribou populations. So Atlantic Gaspésie, Boreal, Southern Mountain populations were all deemed at risk, which is a longer list here of, don't remember the exact number of ecoregions, but it's a lot, and it goes basically across the whole country. So you see here in yellow or light red where they overlap all the ecoregions that combine presence of caribou and threats for forest management activities. So for example, at the very northern end of the Northwest Territories, there's caribou, but no threat of forest management activities, so that's why that area is not in both color. Otherwise, it's any ecoregion touching woodland caribou, basically, or pretty much the whole thing in BC as well, because of lack of presence. But that's one of the most widespread risks that needs to be addressed by most players, include with the indigenous rights. That's the other one that is pretty much national risk. So here the control measures for HC1 are mandatory, which means they are stronger. Test is not going to be the same to move away from or suggest something different. Do note also that depending which one we're talking about, they apply either for all species which means including woodland caribou, or it's going to be other combinations. So starting with the ones that apply to all species, the first one is demonstrate that harvesting does not take place in critical habitat, which is defined, or that harvesting is consistent with a federally approved action plan or range plan, depending on what's being used. So these are somewhat specific, even legal terms. Or that harvesting is permitted through SARA, since the SARA here is the Species at Risk Act for Canada, that do have a section on permitting. So that's first and strongest option for control measure. Then you move to 2. So critical habitat in the sourcing area is deemed protected by the federal government. So we wanted to keep the flexibility that there might be other ways for the federal government to demonstrate or to recognize that there is protection of critical habitat for a given species, other than only the legally specific action plan or Section 73 permit. So again, strong focus on federal government, in large part because it was a primary source of information to identify the risk because of that national scope challenge. Third option, again, and as discussed earlier, if there is an indigenous-led or co-developed land use plan in place, that's control measure. However, only if that plan addresses threats to critical habitat of identified species at risk. So if it's a plan that might be focused on something else or don't have a specific connection with the habitat of the species at risk, then that's caveat on the plan for it to qualify. Again, for all species, but this time only on private SLIMF, so the small and low intensity managed forests, which is defined by FSC. Here a different type of control measure where owners or managers of these private forests are informed about a certain number of things. So informed about critical habitat of these species in that area and the threats to the critical habitat and the best management practice to reduce these threats, as well as the applicable legislation. So control measure about information, but also about information on very specific notions. Now, for all species except woodland caribou, that has different control measures that were developed with somewhat of an elevated standard and scrutiny. So for all other species than woodland caribou, you can use 5 and 6. So evidence demonstrate that action are implemented within the sourcing area to mitigate the threats of the critical habitat as identified in the federal recovery. And also that regionally appropriate best management practice are implemented. And that's going to be defined. So let's spend a bit of time on regionally appropriate best management practice. That's also a concept that's going to be used in other parts of Category 3 about high conservation value. So these, to qualify, they are developed with participation of lots of stakeholders and rights holders. So both the forest manager, the interested and affected stakeholder, the indigenous people, species at risk experts, provincial reps, and certificate holders involved in the sourcing area. So that's already a pretty high bar criteria here to be using the concept of regionally appropriate best management practice because it needs to be developed inclusively. So it's a concept originally that was inspired by what the United States are using in terms of regional best practice, but the process to get there is different. So more involvement in the US by the FSC staff and support. Here it's more written simpler, but the criteria are different. So for those that are of interest in both countries, there's links to be made, but it's not the same control measure. So these BMP have to describe how the risk will be mitigated, identify the sourcing areas where these BMPs are applied, and provide public report, including summary of the area, summary of the meetings that were held, description of the BMP. Also, they need to describe a process to evaluate whether and how these BMPs are being implemented. And finally, a complaint mechanism procedure. So all of that related to control measure number 6 that does not apply to woodland caribou. So it's all other species except woodland caribou. Now we start the ones that apply only for woodland caribou because they're more specific in language. So 7, that's basically using FSC Canada National Forest Management Standard. That's indicator 645, where there's option A, B, C. I'm not going to go in these details, but if you're meeting an equivalent to being an FSCA Forest Management Certified, that is deemed controlled wood. Other option under 8 is to have a management plan, and that's also defined, and we'll go in more detail. And that plan needs to contribute to the recovery of woodland caribou, critical habitat specifically. So what's in that plan? So you have 2 main options, can be both, but it's either or there's best management practice here that focus specifically on reducing disturbance and restore critical habitat, including but not limited to. So it can include either access management or aggregate harvesting or other things. Or the plan might be focused not on BMPs, but on deferral, set-aside, or protection areas within the critical habitat where forest operations are not going to be permitted. In addition of the plan, that includes either a component from A or B, a rationale as part of the plan or provided with the plan as to how these actions will contribute to reduce the level of disturbance over time in critical habitat, in support of meeting the threshold requirements in the federal recovery strategy. So that's lots of detail for control measure 8, but it does also provide options. So it's worth taking the time to put it aside in blocks and assess it by its different pieces. Okay. Yeah, so we said we would define management plan. So it should be understood in its broadest sense. So that's taken from the guidance and taken from other FSC documents. So the plan allows organizations to take voluntary action, provide evidence to auditor without necessarily having such content embedded in the legally approved forest management plan. That's a question we got a lot during the consultation about these. So a plan can be a collection of different things. So collection of documents, reports, records, and maps that describe, justify, and regulate the activities carried out by the organization. So don't have, it's not the legal forest management plan in a nutshell. It's any plan that responds to the other criteria part of that control measure 8. 9. So the organization implements, and that's very different here. So again, back to our menu approach to control measure, trying to address different circumstances for certificate holders. So here this one is about developing a strategy, implementing a strategy to reduce sourcing over the next 5 years, where the management plan do not meet the federal recovery strategy. And to act within your sphere of influence to publicly advocate about the need to finalize and implement all requirements that meet the federal recovery. So we call it the reduce and lobby control measure that is more arm's length from the management. That's an option where you, for certificate holder that might be less directly involved in the underground management, although it can also be used by organization directly involved in management. So it's an option for all. 10, last one, this time, again for woodland caribou, but only for the boreal population, because the terms here only exist in the boreal population recovery strategy. So evidence that critical habitat for that herd is part of what is called experimental adaptive range, which is defined in the federal recovery strategy, which include the fact that it's recognized by provincial and federal government, and it addressed the impact of forest management activities on critical habitat, and is consistent with the federal recovery strategy. So some caveats there, but recognizing that if you're part of an experimental adaptive range, that is an option. So that's it for the long HCV1 risk and control measure. Now we move to high conservation value 2, which also includes the name is landscape level ecosystems and mosaics. The concepts in are intact forest landscapes, large landscape level ecosystem mosaics that are significant at global, regional, or national levels, and that contain viable population of the great majority of natural occurring species. So on that case, with that broad concept and considering what database and information we had to work with for Canada, decision was made to focus HCV2 only on intact forest landscapes, so IFLs across Canada. What the procedure requires that when looking at IFLs, we do use the information created and provided by the Intact Forest website and group. So the latest available that was used was the layer of Intact Forest Landscape for 2016. So that's what we used to create the risk assessment. It might not be the exact same information that you would look at to demonstrate that you're meeting control measure, because you might wish to assess the situation and assess what you're meeting or not meeting in terms of protection measure by using more up-to-date or more local or more refined information. So just to bear in mind that determining the risk and determining if the control measure is met and implemented are two distinct things. So although here the risk designation is going to remain static over time, obviously the situation for IFL will evolve over time. Another note, we've tried a variety of approaches in how to assess risk for IFLs at the ecoregion level, landscape. We ended up with an assessment that is done at the scale of each individual IFLs, which also facilitated the idea of having control measures that would be coherent with how the risk is designated, which was easier to achieve by looking at IFLs one by one and specific than by other spatial determinations. How was it done? So the individual IFL assessment looked at a number of things, starting with whether or not these IFLs were impacted by forestry in the first place. So if there's no overlap with a forestry tenure, based on our latest information on forestry tenure, that was low risk. Same if the overlap is smaller than the 20% threshold. So for a large IFL, it means that if you have less than 20% overlap, these are at low risk, because if you harvest the full tenure in 1 year, the IFL is still not going to go under the thresholds provided by the FSC International Guidance, which is basically the advice note about the protection of intact forest landscapes, which calls for minimum 50,000 hectare and maximum of 20% harvest. For small IFLs, that's where you need to look at both thresholds, so the 20%, but also not going under 50,000 hectares. So if the overlap is smaller than that, then again, that's a low risk. If the overlap is larger, then you look further at these threats from forest management activities. So not in tenure, formally in protected area, or within FSC certified management unit, which is out of scope basically, or deemed protected because there's already some criteria that will apply to this value. And looking at that overlap, then we looked at it with a sliding scale, which is based on size. So the larger the IFL, the smaller the protection in terms of percentage. that was required to consider it low risk. These ranges were not, well, they were picked by the working group, but they were taken from the latest FSC Canada discussion document about the identification of intact forest landscapes. So we carried that proposed notion, which does not yet apply to forest management, to be clear, but we've used it here to give us more flexibility than just applying the 20% advice note, which also only applies to forest management, but not to control wood. So, so connected to the previous one, so the last degree of sliding scale is the small IFLs. So it takes 90% because the tolerance is only 10% that are not threatened by commercial activities, so not in tenure and protected area and FSC. If so, then they are also considered low risk. All the remaining ones that were not considered to have enough protection within them already were then deemed specified risk. And here they are. So that's, don't remember if it's 60 some of them or 90 some of them, but that's how they spread across the country. You have a similar map at the end of the risk assessment. It's just here it's reproduced, but color coding the size of the IFL to give a sense of what types of thresholds are going to be applying to them. Moving now to the control measures, which again are mandatory. So the first one, which is always an option, so do not harvest in the risk area. So if forest operations are not occurring within IFLs, obviously that's a control measure. And if they meet the same thresholds as discussed earlier, so it's a bit hard to read, but basically, depending on the size of the IFL, you're going to be applying, you're going to allow for more and more cumulative impacts of forest operations. And when you say cumulative impacts within an IFL, obviously that's one challenge, but it's all operations, so not a organization or a certificate holder impacts, but the cumulative impacts of all forest operations within that IFL. So it can be multiple players that you have to look in their footprint to validate that these thresholds are met. Third, again, the indigenous-led or co-developed land use plan is again an option, but this time it's only if that plan addresses threats to landscape-level ecosystems and mosaics. So here, we did not specifically use the term intact forest landscape because it might not be the terminology that would emanate from such land use plan, but we rather use the larger concept of HCV2, which is landscape-level ecosystems and mosaics. So that gives more potential for connection to these indigenous land use plans. Four, these are based out of what was there under the company risk assessment, the current framework thresholds, and suggest that, well, they were not exactly control measures, but ways to determine if these are at risk or not. So if there's an approach, well, forest management is approaching national regional stakeholders representing environmental and social interests, as well as indigenous people, to develop an approach for HCV2. So at the supply unit level, and there's support from the participants and indigenous people, and there's no substantial objection. So some might recognize that language from 4005 about company risk assessment. But that's a rewrite here. It's also different, better includes indigenous people, but that's one option. Also, this is a broader one. Evidence demonstrated a minimum of 80% of the IFL is not threatened by forest management activities. So it's a different threshold than the above, but it's a bit of the baseline threshold of 20 and 50,000 hectares. That's also an option. Here we also have the option to develop regionally appropriate best management practices. And if I'm not mistaken, it's exactly defined in the same way. So I'll just skip, also cognizant of time. Again, here, the idea of having options that only apply to non-primary producers. So it's also, how do I say that, don't source and lobby. So it's, again, a copy of the control measure we've seen above, about harvesting less, sourcing less from the region and influencing public decision, which is the end of the menu for HCV2, which brings us to HCV4, Critical Ecosystem Services. Here, went very different. It was more of a legal assessment of whether or not there's legal protection in place for these different subcategories: flooding, erosion, destructive fires, clean water catchment. In the end, the only risk determined were focused on erosion and specifically on landslides that can create erosion. So we assessed it through landslide susceptibility and fatalities, and then look at whether or not there was protection measures in place legally established. So for Yukon and Northwest Territories, it was determined that there was an absence of precise regulations on landslides other than some criteria for riparian buffer. So it did not meet the same test and threshold as the other province, so it was deemed specified risk. Simpler than other menu and more targeted on the subject. The control measures here that are, again, mandatory are about demonstrating that the terrain assessment studies show a susceptibility risk that is at or above scale 5. The areas where, or should it say under? I'll double check that. Areas where landslide susceptibility risk is at or above scale 5, these are avoided. And same idea, but only partial harvesting occur and no road or scale trail construction taking place. So some more specific control measures here on a narrower subject. Which brings us to the last risk that was determined under category 4. There's two things that are looked at, so conversion to plantation and conversion to non-forest use, also called deforestation. Interestingly, that's the one where a risk was determined, and it was determined by looking at the most recent data from the National Deforestation Monitoring System at the finer scale at which they were able to provide the data to us at the time. Still working on that. You see in bold here the 4 areas and the reason why these are at risk. It mentions on the next slide, but either of these thresholds can create risk. So either you have more than 5,000 hectares per year in average of deforestation in any given size of region, it's at risk automatically, no other option. And if it's above 0.02%, it's also an automatic risk. So we worked hard with International to try to explain our context and see if other threshold, other approach, other ways to evaluate the risk could be explored and tested. In the end, it did not work. So threshold number 4 forced us into a specified risk for 3 reporting zones: so boreal shield, east, boreal plains, and mixed wood plains. I'll go to the map and come back to the control measure. There isn't a map of these regions in the National Risk Assessment, but you can go in the publication by the Canadian Forest Service about the National Deforestation Monitoring System, and you will quickly see where they are. So, for example, the boreal shield is that full green region. but if you only look at the reporting zone, then the east part is going to be 15. It's going to cut at the province between Quebec and Ontario, basically. And so that's where that risk is going to be. Providing that because it's at this moment missing from the national risk assessment. So here we have both mandatory and recommended control measure. So don't be too confused. 3 options in mandatory. So again, and obviously you demonstrate that the material does not originate from areas being converted, or that it originates from acceptable sources of conversion, which include conversion that results in conservation benefit, or publicly approved changes in zoning, but here within urban areas. And I don't think that's specifically defined, so that's something that could be explored. Third option, the organization demonstrates support for existing integrated land management processes. So they need to be pre-existing, but you can support these processes to reduce the cumulative impact of changes to non-forest landscape. So that's your third option. Also, a recommended one, if you have demonstrated that you can't or have something more appropriate to use than the mandatory one, you can move to the recommended. And you can simply raise the profiles of deforestation in the region and advocate for options to reduce conversion rates. So that gives you a last option there, or something else if you want to demonstrate that this also is not doable possible. And I spoke to the map, which concludes all risk and control measure. And we'll move in another part of the presentation and take questions on all of this only at the end. So keep that in mind or take notes if there was anything on specific risk and specific control measures. So there, I'll let you go on this next part, Chiara.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Etienne, and thank you for a very comprehensive overview of the National Risk Assessment and going through the technical content and providing additional resources where possible. That's really helpful. So I will take you through the next few slides to the end of the presentation, and we'll get into the questions and answers session at that point. So just a reminder, please continue to add your questions to the question tab, or if you need help with that, message Nikki in the chat box. I'll be covering the 4 aspects I'll be touching on will hopefully be helpful to certificate holders and organizations looking at sourcing wood in Canada. And my goal is to help with understanding auditing timelines, various terminology, and how it all links to the standard, and hopefully spark some thoughts in terms of organizations mitigating risk and demonstrating compliance. All right. So first off, let's talk about your audit. So you're implementing FSC's Canada's National Risk Assessment. If you're an existing certificate holder, you have 6 months from the date of approval to implement the NRA. So the approval date was the 26th of June, which is just last month. So if you have an audit date coming up before the 26th of December, an existing certificate holder will have a choice of either using your existing company risk assessment to inform your due diligence system, basically similar to what you were doing at your last audit. Maybe there are some updates that you've made to your company risk assessment, but you can still use that before the 26th of December. Or if you wish, you may transition onto the National Risk Assessment for your next audit. So that means you would have it fully implemented, you would have identified what specified risk is in your supply base, and you will have implemented the control measures to mitigate that risk in accordance with the National Risk Assessment. So basically, you have a choice of one or the other. If you choose the National Risk Assessment, you have to demonstrate that it's fully implemented. Okay. Quick note here, an additional audit is not required. Your due diligence system will be audited as part of your natural audit cycle. So if, for example, you're an existing certificate holder, your audit was scheduled for May 2020, there will not be an additional audit required once we pass the 26th of December mark. Your due diligence system will be audited at your May date, the original natural audit cycle. However, you will need to demonstrate that you had implemented control measures by the 26th of December. So your auditor will be looking for evidence that of implementation by that date, yet it won't be assessed until that May date or whatever date your audit will be. Okay. Next, we have the implementation timeline for new certificate holders. So these will be organizations that are new to FSC controlled wood and are seeking to source wood from Canada for the first time, or existing certificate holders that are expanding their scope to source from Canada. So for these situations, you will be required to use the National Risk Assessment from now onwards, because you are in the process of developing your due diligence system. You will be using the most applicable and relevant data to inform your decision making in your due diligence system, and that is the National Risk Assessment for Canada. So that's particular for new certificate holders or organizations that are on here from other countries such as the US or Japan or other areas of the globe that will be sourcing from Canada will need to use the National Risk Assessment from now onwards when you're starting your sourcing from Canada. And the final message there is after December 26th, it doesn't matter whether you're new or existing, all organizations will need to be using the risk as designated in the National Risk Assessments and the control measures within. Okay, so one of the biggest shifts in mindset for both certificate holders and auditors is from assessing risk through your company risk assessment to now actually shifting your focus to the control measures and how risk is being mitigated. So risk is already outlined. Now a certificate holder's due diligence system will need to demonstrate control measure implementation and appropriateness. Okay, so under the specified risk in the National Risk Assessment, you have two options. A certificate holder has two options. You either don't source from an area of specified risk, where you completely avoid, or the other option is you implement control measures to mitigate that risk. So you're bringing risk from specified to low risk. And that's really the focus of this entire presentation today, is this aspect where organizations will have to be implementing control measures. So specified risk has been identified in 5 different indicators across 3 categories of controlled wood. They will differ between recommended and mandatory. So under category 2.3, we saw from Etienne's presentation that there were 5 control measures that are recommended. For the high conservation value indicators that have specified risk, we're seeing that all of those are mandatory. And then we get into the conversion aspect, which is 4.1, which has a combination of both. So that's mandatory, and there's 1 recommended control measure in there as well. Okay, somebody move my slide forward. Okay. All right, there we go. So let's talk a little bit about what that means, the mandatory versus recommended control measures. So under the 40005 standard, it states under section 4.12 that the organisation shall implement control measures provided as mandatory in the applicable national risk assessment. And as Etienne was saying earlier on in the presentation there, that these were considered, I think the word was like strong control measures that are outlined in the national risk assessment as mandatory. However, there is a clause here that is clause 4.13, and it outlines 3 requirements that must be met to not use mandatory control measures. So I've outlined these in points A, B, and C. This isn't the exact, A, B, and C is not the exact language of the standard. I've just kind of shortened it for the purpose of this slide. However, what it's saying is that control measures in the an organization would have to justify and prove why control measures in the national risk assessment are inadequate to mitigate risk in your organization's specific operations. So that's the first thing there. If you don't find that these mandatory control measures work for your organization, you need to provide information as to why. You need to justify that. Then your organization would need to demonstrate this to your certification body and auditor and show that you have alternative control measures and that those are sufficient, and then go that step further and be approved by the certification body. And then after that, the description of the alternative control measures and the justification as to why the mandatory control measures don't work for you all get submitted to FSC Canada to the maintenance of the national risk assessment. So it's kind of a circular process. It's a feedback loop into the system. And this 4.13 section exists so that innovation is still possible, or new technology or new information is made available in the context of your organization or your region or nationally, so that it can be captured and fed back into the system. And FSC may incorporate that in newer versions in 5 years or when the next review is. Okay. But that said, mandatory control measures as they stand must be used. That's mandatory is a must or a shall, unless you can prove otherwise under 4.13. And recommended control measures are exactly that. They're a recommendation, they're not mandatory. You may find some other alternative measures that adequately mitigate risk, and they can be included in your due diligence system. So under 2.3, which is the rights of Indigenous and traditional peoples are upheld, all of those measures in there are recommended. So they may be used, or there may be some alternatives to that, but again, it has to be justified. And that's why at the bottom of the slide here, justification is in red writing and highlighted here, because you may make those decisions, but when you're going in for your audit, it's about justifying those decisions, being able to document the process and show through documents or records or other evidence why the alternative control measures are more sufficient for your situation. The mandatory measures, of course, are all for the high conservation value section. And then under the conversion criteria, there are 3 mandatory and 1 recommended. And actually, I'll talk about that in the slide when I get there, because we'll have everything up in front of us, and I'll explain there why there's both mandatory and recommended on there. But we'll talk about that at that point. But hopefully that explains right now the critical differences between mandatory and recommended, and your options using the controlled wood standard under 4.13. Next, Etienne did hit on the limitations and challenges that FSC Canada endured to try and bring the national risk assessment to fruition. And one of the bigger ones for auditors is the complexity in supply chains. And I think it's also a large one for certificate holders as well. So it is the responsibility of the certificate holder to apply their due diligence system across the supply chain and to ensure that there's low risk of sourcing from the 5 controversial sources of wood, which are the 5 categories, and to ensure that there's no risk of mixing in the supply chain. So that is the entire system in a nutshell and the responsibility of a certificate holder. FSC Canada have recognized the complexity in the sentence here that it's reflected in the menu approach to mandatory control measures, with some control measures addressing forest level demonstration of risk mitigation. And then you have others addressing the non-forest level demonstration of risk mitigation. So what's on the screen here is an illustration of what a supply chain can look like. This is a pretty simple supply chain. I think most of you will recognize that, where it's just going forest to the sawmill, to another processor, to a secondary furniture processor. This is where the pulp and paper mills are further along the supply chain and further from the stump. Supply chains typically look like, it's not just one forest, it might be 8 or 10 forestry areas feeding into 5 or 6 sawmills to, 3 or 4 factories into, and if you're the certificate holder sitting up here in the furniture processing unit, you may see these kind of chains going out in many directions, and they're like a spider web. So that is a very challenging position to be in. However, the risk assessment does outline some mitigation measures that are available, or control measures that are available to you if you sit on that position in the supply chain. And we'll get through some of the control measures that are required, and maybe think about some of the questions you can ask in your supply chain to gather the information, to get that communication of your management system down the supply chain to the forest management level, which is where a lot of the actions need to take place, and to get evidence from that level back up to you where you sit on the supply chain. Okay. But ultimately, a certificate holder must adequately apply and demonstrate control measures to ensure control of their wood supply, and in the end to use the controlled wood, FSC controlled wood claim. Okay. Each of the, pardon me, each of the indicators and their control measures, they do indicate whether there is a forest level mitigation measure or a non-forest level sourcing risk control measure. However, for some, what I've noticed is like for section 3.1, it's all at the forest level, and the same with 3.4 and a little bit with 4.1. So as we get into that, we'll look at each area of specified risk and think of what type of questions you may need to ask of yourselves in an organization, and what an auditor may ask you in order to seek evidence of conformance. Okay. Okay. So what does that mean? Here I've just put the exact language of the National Risk Assessment for indicator 2.3 here on the screen. The control measures that are outlined in the National Risk Assessment are specified for each risk. Each organisation will need to make decisions on which control measures are most appropriate and can be implemented by their organisation. So it is not the role of an auditor or certification body to say which control measures are right. We don't have the answer to that, and each organisation is different. An auditor's role is to assess the organisation's approach to sourcing wood from areas of specified risk, their implementation of control measures, and if the organisation's due diligence system meets the standard. What we're looking for is evidence of conformance, and the organisation must tell that story through documentation or records, tracking systems, interviews, to show conformance. Each organisation may take a different approach to the same risk, which is why there are different options under the control measures. And it doesn't mean one is right or wrong, it just depends on the situation your organisation is in. So what will auditors be looking for? So ultimately, we're looking for conformance. It's not an exercise in tripping people up. We're simply trying to assess your organization's due diligence system and your management system against a predefined standard, and using the National Risk Assessment measures also. It's generally a very transparent process, and the idea is to find the conformance as part of the audit. So for primary producers, or forest level suppliers here for section 2.3, some of the questions may be like, are there any active opposition to the forest management plan? Is this information in the public domain? It might be something an auditor would do a search on the internet before you go to a particular area, or you're assessing a particular supply base. If there is something out there, okay, so then the next question is, what is your organization's process for this? Or how did your organization work with the information? If an agreement exists as per point number 2 up here, does the organization have a copy? Can documented evidence be shown to an auditor? Does it demonstrate conformance? Further things, are there land use plans in place? Can it be demonstrated that these are Indigenous led or co-developed? What does it look like? If you're here, there is a control measure that is outlined for non-primary producers, which is the folks further away from the stump or the forest. Pulp and paper manufacturers or furniture manufacturers, you're just that bit further removed from forest management activities. So here it is, there is an option, it's a recommendation for a dispute resolution process. So this would be something that potentially could be set up within your organization. Is this a process that can be developed in-house? If so, has it been communicated to your suppliers? What evidence can you show of that? Was training of your suppliers required? Was there training for staff on the dispute resolution process? And showing evidence of that. That would be records of attendance at training, or maybe it's in your supplier agreement that this dispute resolution process is there, and how do people, organizations further down the chain know about this dispute resolution process, and is there a vessel for that information to pass to and fro? So these are all types of things to think about in terms of being placed further from the forest management activities in the supply chain, asking those questions in your organization and finding the information and documented evidence for that. Okay, we'll move on. So rather than listing all of the control measures yet again, and Etienne did a really nice job going through each of them individually on a technical aspect. I have a map here just showing the high conservation value indicator 3.1 and the areas of specified risk. So one thing to note here is, especially for the high conservation value specified risk, prior to the national risk assessment, organizations conducted company risk assessments to assess the risk within your supply chain. And this mechanism should still be there. However, now rather than focusing on the risk identification, it is actually acknowledging the existing specified risk and focusing on the risk mitigation through control measures. So acknowledging risk would be like, which critical habitats are you sourcing from small or low intensity managed forests? Is there the potential for woodland caribou? And then matching the appropriate mandatory control measures with the risk in your supply base. Moving then to showing evidence of conformance. One of the key things here is the understanding that the management plan can be a portfolio or a collection of documents, reports, records, and maps that describe, justify, and regulate the activities carried out by any forest manager or staff or organization in relation to the sourcing area. And this includes statements of objectives and policies. So it's not a forest management plan in the strictest of senses. It's rather a broad, all-encompassing approach. So it's using all of the documents beyond the legal entity of the forest management plan. So what is required here is clear, verifiable evidence that regulate forest management activities to show risk mitigation. These are fairly clearly laid out, or very clearly laid out, I should say, in the National Risk Assessment under each of the options. But if you're, again, one of the secondary organizations in the supply chain, how can you ensure conformance? So do you have contracts or supplier agreements? And these are the types of questions an auditor could ask. What is in your contracts or your supplier agreements? Do you have specifics on the control measures? What about your supplier audits? What evidence do you gather at those? Does the evidence show conformance in the supply chain to the forest level, where the risks to habitats and ecoregions exist? So what really is happening here in your internal supplier audits is to put on your auditor glasses, gather the information, be that in documents, checklists, records, and you're gathering all that information for your internal due diligence system. And that is exactly what is presented to the auditor at the time of your audit. So you're pretty much doing the same thing as an auditor would do, but just further down the supply chain, you go to your suppliers and ask those types of questions. Okay, again here, so we're moving into indicator 3.2, high conservation value regarding intact forest landscapes. So the IFLs have clear mandatory control measures for primary suppliers, including the types of documentation you could provide as evidence. Here, accurate mapping for supply areas near IFLs would be a key component. For secondary suppliers, there is a mandatory measure. And so that is to continually and progressively reduce sourcing over the next 5 years from IFLs, and the organization raises the profile of management and enhancement of IFLs. So here we might look at, like, what are your policies on this? How is this being communicated to your suppliers? Is there accurate mapping within your supplier agreements? Are suppliers aware of the areas they need to avoid in order for you to meet your strategy and to reduce sourcing over the next 5 years? So these are the types of questions to ask yourselves within the organization, to seek the types of evidence that is required, and then present that to an auditor. Section or indicator 3.4. This is pertinent to any organization that would be potentially sourcing from the Yukon and Northwest Territories. Again, so it is figuring that out. Are your suppliers sourcing from these areas? Are there maps available? Is there any public, maybe in the future, public maps available or studies available? What does the forest management plan say? Is there anything documented in there that can be used? Or was there a pre-harvest process? Were these assessments taken, or have these assessments taken place? So that's really about, getting the communication up the supply chain to the certificate holder in order to be able to demonstrate adequate risk mitigation for indicator 3.4 for the Yukon and Northwest Territories. All right. So lastly, again, we're at the section 4.1 or indicator 4.1, which is in relation to conversion. I promised you I'd go through the difference here between the mandatory control measures and the recommended control measures. So here we have 3 mandatory control measures. So remembering back to the standard, section 4.13 states that if you find that none of these mandatory control measures are relevant for your organization, you need to provide justification as to why they will not, they're not appropriate. And then you can either use the recommended control measure, which is here at the bottom, number 1, or an alternative control measure that you may find. So here, what this is basically saying is the National Risk Assessment is laying out 3 mandatory control measures. If they don't work, your organization needs to say why. Then you can move into the recommended control measure or another alternative control measure, and we go through that circular process again with the section 4.13 of the standard. Excuse me. Okay. So here, let's look at what evidence could be supplied. Does the organization have timber market information? Are there access to maps? Is there any information on volume received from acceptable sources of conversion? How is the organization justifying this wood from acceptable conversion? Were planning permits available? Is your organization or staff involved with a local or regional land planning process? Have you got details of that? Is it documented? What is the intent of that involvement? Are any of these measures on your supplier agreement? Do you have evidence of their implementation through your supplier audits? So these are all aspects to consider. So ultimately, it's about documentation and justification, and really like telling the story of what your organization is doing. I understand that from being a forester and having worked in a forestry organization that it is a hard story to tell. And as, also when you get into the pulp and paper industry and further up that supply chain, it is difficult to tell all of the work that goes into this, but it's more is better. Just lay everything out and tell the story from start to finish and document as much as possible through policies, procedures, records, strategies, internal audits, supplier audits, all of that type of documentation will go a long way to telling the story. Okay. So that's the last indicator with the risk, and I appreciate all of you attending because you've spent a long time listening to both myself and Etienne, and we really do appreciate your participation. So we'll move into the questions and answer session right now, and we will do our best to answer your questions. Some questions may require a little bit more feedback from FSC, but again, we will answer what we can. At the end of next week, we'll be sending out a recorded copy of this presentation and document with the questions and answers on there, except for the ones we need to go further to figure out. Okay, so Etienne, do we have any questions already rolling in?
Yes, so we have one question from Ted Hendricks. So I'll read that one to you, and then we can probably move to, we have two raised hands as well by André Gravel and Julie Griffith. So if you still have your question there, although you raised your hand some time ago, be ready to speak to it. We'll unmute you after. I'll start by reading the one that was written in the question box by Ted. So regarding new certificate holders or those expanding into Canada as a sourcing area, is the requirement to use the FSC Canada National Risk Assessment as the most current and best data on risk, an FSC requirement, or one being required by SCS for certificate holder? So should all CBs be requiring this and auditing to that as part of a due diligence system between now and December 26, 2019. So, Kara, that might be more on your end to answer. I'm not sure if you got that. If you want Ted to expand, we can unmute him, or if you had were able to read it.
Okay. Okay, I can see the question now. I was struggling to get that put up there. So basically the question is whether all organizations expanding into Canada need to start using the National Risk Assessment. That is, Ted, that's the approach we at SCS have taken with all organizations moving into new areas with national risk assessments, be it the US, Canada, Brazil, Australia. What we have found is that a lot of work goes into company risk assessment, and you would be putting that work into the company risk assessment to then do it again within less than 6 months to then incorporate the national risk assessment. So for organizations that are new, we are requiring them to use the national risk assessment off the bat. However, the requirement is that it's the 26th of December, but it just leads to an organization doing twice the amount of work in a very short time. That's the thinking behind that, and that's the approach that we have been taking. But there could be justification otherwise. Do you want to be unmuted, Ted, if you have any response on that one? Let me figure out.
So I will unmute Ted just in case he wants to add anything. So Ted Hendricks, you are unmuted if you want to chime in.
You there, Ted? Okay, maybe not. Maybe the answer was enough, but yeah.
Okay, so only other mention, oh, it's gone. So everybody put their hands down, and Ted indicated that the question is answered. So at this point, we don't have another question. So happy to give some more time if people want to raise their hand, tap in the chat box, or type questions in. and you can see if none, then we'll cut shortly. Otherwise, you still have time to come up with new questions.
Etienne, we did have a couple of questions that we had prior to the webinar. One was regarding indicator 2.3 and what the definition of opposition was. Oh, hang on, okay.
Yeah.
So we had spoken to FSC about this, and it is really looking at what is active. You know, there may have been opposition in the past and it got resolved, but the key word in there for us is it active? Is it an active opposition, and how that is being dealt with by your organization, or at a regional level. So that was one question. Okay, it looks like there's another question here from Andre.
Yeah, so question, how will we calibrate between CB, between region, between Canada and US, and in the rest of the world? Small question.
So calibration, that is the job of ASI, who are the accreditation body above all CBs. So that's why they conduct audits annually using a sample-based approach to ensure that we're all applying our interpretations in a similar manner. But also, I think it's important that there is a forum for dialogue with certification bodies, maybe through FPAC or another way of doing that. But like where similar questions or issues are coming up, I mean, we do this in the US, where we've had a forum between CBs to really talk about different approaches that certificate holders may take, to look at some of the more nuanced sections of the national risk assessment, and how different CBs are interpreting that, to try and come up with kind of a uniform approach, because we want to be consistent right across each CB. And where there is interpretation needed, that often will go back into FSC itself to say, okay, we need a little bit more help with this.
I'll unmute Andre if you want to respond and see if we answer the question. And this time, I'm unmuted. Go ahead. Wait, bonjour.
Do you hear me? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for answering. I know it's not an easy question, but I think we, as a country and as a certificate holder, I think we were pioneer with FSC, and with the big changes that we have now with the new FM and the new NRA, we will need to keep having discussion about how we do things, because certification is not new. Control wood is not new. So how can we keep? How can we? I think we face the issue of staying within the standard for the future, even if we've been certificate holders for long term. for a long time. So I think we will need many of those exchange like you do this afternoon in order to find solution, and when because there are solutions on the way we will implement that NRA, and also the way we will implement the new FM.
Great, Andre. I agree. I agree on that. I think you can't go wrong with open dialogue and workshopping some of these common concerns, and kind of everybody, you know, moving together in the same in the right direction. So I think that's a very good point you've raised, and yeah, I'll definitely take that on board. What are your thoughts, Etienne?
I mean, I think there's going to be different tracks of discussion that need to happen, and it can be in a variety of ways, including sharing between CBs, between certificate holder. I think there's a lot also of these control measures that point at some regional dialogue about some issues. Whether or not this is going to be the control measure that are selected, I think there's a lot of instances where it might be better and easier for the system to be carried on through regional approaches or regional discussion and sharing of information rather than strictly individual approaches. That might also be lots of duplication of efforts. But yeah, there's also some technical option to revise as we go and bring forward new evidence as you work on control measure and demonstrating that you're achieving something on the ground. Sometimes it might lead you to new information that could not only go in how you're demonstrating that you're meeting control measure, but could be also shared with FSC to be considered as additions or revision to the national risk assessment. One thing that I quickly mention is we're still in dialogue about deforestation, for example, and trying to get more refined data from the National Deforestation Monitoring Center. As soon as we get that, we'll try to publish that and be asking for revision of the NRA to make the risk more narrow and specific, but there might be other similar types of additional information or analysis that could be brought to the discussion, both from a more sharing, but also technical box and aspects of changing even the risk assessment more regularly than just every 5 years.
Yeah, thanks for your answers. Because for me, with only 16% of the Canadian forests that are FSC FM, there is still a lot of work to do in order to improve the forest management practices and to I think we will need to work to expand the land base of FSC and also the overall forest management practices for the ones that are not certified, but and those are not bad. Most of them are not bad the way they act, but we will need to adapt. So thanks, and we will be pleased to join groups that will want to share ideas on how to achieve the standard and the indicators and the standard.
Great, thanks very much, Andre. I appreciate your interaction here.
If anyone would prefer to make this question orally rather than written, you can just raise your hand and we'll open the line for you. It's another option. So anyone else in these last 10 minutes would like to provide question or other types of observation?
I guess both of our email addresses are up there as well. So if something comes to mind after the presentation, or I'm sure it will in the coming months, I mean, feel free to reach out as well.
Okay, so seeing none and hearing none, we might leave it there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Last. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you all for staying with us this full 2 hours in good number in the middle of the summer. Was great. So thanks for your participation. Looking forward to any follow-up question or ideas about the way forward as alluded by André. And hope this was as useful as possible. And good luck and have fun with these significant changes. We'll be there to support you, but lots on the go.
Did we just get another question in here?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, everybody. Yeah, same for me. Thanks for everyone for coming along, participating, and we look forward to follow up, and have a great Friday, and thank you.